thanks very much, Ben and Gio. We'll head right to the prompt so we can get going. And the first one is about difference, and we're posing it to Eva to begin. And we phrase it in this way. What does visual self-portraiture have to teach us about differences between ourselves and others? So is it possible, perhaps, to quote-unquote overcome differences through self-representational art? And perhaps, are there any artworks in this room, in this exhibition, that register and complicate how we think about difference? Again, in quotes. Thank you, Eva.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Sarah and Janice, for having me here. It's a great honor to be on this panel, and it's also an incredible pleasure to be given the gift of this amazing exhibition. So I want to thank you for this. You've given me a wonderful prompt, so I want to thank you for this, and asked me to think about difference in the context of self-portraiture. Indeed, I think that difference is a key concept in self-representation. I'd say that in the history of the genre of self-portrait begins with the assertion of difference, the artist's unique signature, the emergence of individualism, of the individual subject, of humanism, Western humanism in particular. But this moment of the emergence of difference, the individual self, is already ridden with paradoxes and contradictions, because it provokes the question of who can be constituted as the subject of self-portraiture. Those unique selves that you see in self-portraiture all belong to one category, white middle-class males. So the self-portrait, when you view it historically, can be seen as a technology of self, a way of producing certain kinds of bodies as the subject of the gaze, while relegating others to the status of the object of the gaze. In that sense, we could say that self-portrait is complicit with the establishment of the dominant relations of ruling, which might be, summarized in a shorthand as white, male, heteronormative, capitalist, colonial supremacy. All the representations in this exhibition engaged in critical dialogue with that history, with that tradition. And you can look, for example, how it is emblematically presented by Joyce Wieland, who takes on the female nude in Western painting, inserting herself as both the subject and the object of the gaze, with an ironic type of the woman amusing herself, also suggesting that women were not serious artists. This woman is just amusing herself. Or you can look at Andy Warhol or Kent Monkman in drag, who also challenged this, who is the subject of self-portraiture, who can be the subject of self-portraiture. So I've been reflecting on the meaning of the exhibition. This is me, this is also me. And it emphasizes the presence of selves and bodies that have been excluded from this tradition by virtue of their difference, from this dominant entitled subject of self-representation. So we're looking here at self-inscriptions of those who have been relegated to the category of the other, who inhabit women's bodies, indigenous bodies, queer bodies, bodies of color, bodies with mental illness, with disabilities. But there's another facet to the title that points us in a different direction of thinking about difference in the context of self-portraiture. Another paradox of self-representation. The 19th century French poet Arthur Rimbaud famously said, "J'ai est un autre." I is the other. Now this phrase points to the impossibility of self-representation, which may be also related to some artists' obsessions with seriality, multiplicity, and fragmentation of self, or it may be related to time and change, to mutability, to differences within the subject. And it can also be viewed in terms of self and identity as always in excess of itself. So every time the artist says, this is me, this is also me, they also say, this is not me. And at this point, I just want to pull this together and say that you can think about it in terms of two levels of conceptualizing difference in self-portraiture that might be perhaps helpful. The first one is difference as a social category. Difference as ascribed or imposed through gendering, racialization, or heteroregulation, or even difference sometimes assumed voluntarily, as in identity politics and self-assertion of identity. Here, this is not me, might quite often be seen as a rejection of those imposed categories of the violence of representation. And you can see that quite clearly, for instance, in Rebecca Belmore's absolutely magnificent image, the white thread of racialization, which is also threat of racialization. Or the irony of Carl Beam's arrow, which also, protests this kind of imposition. So there's this constant negotiation and renegotiation of identity. The other level, apart from the social difference, can best be explained through the post-structuralist concept of différance with an A. So it's kind of like a new coinage. It combines difference and différal. That's why it's called différance with an A. This was coined by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, who not accidentally is also the author of a book on self-portraiture. What does différance remind us of? It reminds us that every self is always already in the process of construction, fluid, heterogeneous, in flux, incomplete, fragmented, that there is no truth to the subject of self-portraiture, that this truth is always deferred, pointing to other meanings, other concepts, relations to other selves. It is also a deferral of death, whose invisible presence haunts so many of those representations. And you can think, for instance, of Edouard Munch, you can think of Mohalinagi's photographs, or genealogies of those who are already departed. So to sum up, difference is constitutive of the self on a spectrum of signification ranging from affirmative and celebratory to sinister and oppressive meanings. The black feminist poet Audre Lorde says that it's not differences between ourselves and others that divide us, but it is how we use them for connection, respect, celebration of life's heterogeneity rather than its suppression. So what fascinates me in this exhibition is the many uses of self to direct and redirect the gaze and to trouble the personal and social truth of the subject. So self-representation in that sense can be seen as an intervention into the inherited regimes of difference, into those oppressive discourses or scripts of identity, gendered, racialized, heteroregulated, and also into historical narratives of belonging. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eva. I don't know if anyone would like to step in, or we can proceed with another. Oh, how would you like to go? Any thoughts?
Bar high.
It was a great prompt.
Yes. I think the next prompt follows well because it asks us to think about feeling. What role does feeling play in how viewers might respond to self-portraiture? So maybe this can connect in some ways with the quotation you offered, either from Audre Lorde. How does feeling connect with what we do and how we respond to differences? So we'd like to ask T to talk about this question of feeling practices in politics.
Well, first I want to say that I feel thankful for being part of this conversation, and speak first to the initial discomfort I had about working on the project that I did, because I thought later on, well, if I get this book published, then people are going to think that I'm the feeling person. And if you know, that people would think that I'm the feeling person. And if you know me at all, you know that I don't like to feel. I feel very uncomfortable about feelings, and maybe that was what writing a book about feelings was about, to have a critical perspective on feeling. So I'll just start by, I don't know, perhaps narrating an experience that you might have had when you walked into this gallery and looked at these incredible pieces. I went through them, and I think about feeling in two senses. The affective attachment that we might have to our sense of ourselves that we might want to visually represent, or the sense of self that others represent for us. So that's one way of engaging the concept of feeling. The second that I thought about a lot as I walked through this gallery was the tactile dimension. And what's remarkable about so many of these very stunning pieces is just how much they evoked tactility. And I have to confess, I'm such a bad museum goer because I really wanted to touch. And these pieces, so this one in particular, or Kent Monkman, his piece that is kind of behind plexiglass or plastic or whatever. So that's that. I suppose we can touch plastic, but we really want to touch the fur, and that's the lusciousness of fur, even though we're not supposed to feel that fur is luscious any longer. But and the desire that is evoked, I think that so there's an irony here, especially in the gallery or the museum, that we have this lure of tactility, of feeling, but we can only observe that sense of feeling. And so immediately there is a distance, and I'm not critiquing that distance, and I don't want anybody in the museum to feel that I'm critiquing the museum practices here at all, but I think it could be a very productive way of thinking about that kind of that irrevocable, unnecessary divide. So that's the first thing. So what does it mean then to observe the fact that you want to feel whatever that feeling might be, and the fact that it's at a remove. I'm not sure Kent Monkman was, I sense that he wanted to tease us, that lure is a sense of a tease, the fact that I misrecognized it as some kind of hat, but it turns out that it is so not a hat. This speaks a lot to my desires as opposed to other people's desires in that particular moment. So the joke that's played upon viewer and the kinds of feelings that we project upon objects. So that's the first, and I think I'm just going to talk about that one resonance, the feely dimension that has been theorized by so many very smart people, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But I really want to talk about the art pieces in this gallery. The piece in the other room that I love so much, whose name. The one with the arrow. Karpinski. This is a painted photograph. And what's so amazing about it is that he starts with this photograph, and I'm not entirely sure it's self-portraiture, but it becomes self-portraiture when the paint frames the photograph. But the paint also splashes or is placed all over, and it's a long history of that kind of reworking, making different the photographic representation through painting. And so that moment, the arrow, that the kind of rigidity of the arrow that is pointing into one direction, that is contradicted by the subjects pointing to the opposite direction, the brush strokes that are going in multiple directions. That was an amazing moment of kind of the tactility of that surface and the complex tactilities that are calling upon us to attend to kind of all of the poles, the contradictory poles that are happening in that same moment. And that speaks to kind of that notion of difference that was so compelling. And then my last point, because I want to make sure that people can jump in, is to go back a little bit to that sense of distance. And Eva alluded to it earlier. I'm very interested in kind of the otherness, what it means to represent the self through that other. And sometimes what the most interesting moments are when the self is represented through otherness entirely. When artists or when you or I decide that what is me is not going to be this face or this body, but instead it's going to be a piece of cloth, an inert object, or that amazing, it looks like a primordial surface that again I really wanted to touch over there, and in the very back corner. So after this, please look at all of this stuff. So I think it's too pat to call that kind of a fetish object. I think that what it speaks to is a material history, trace connection that we might have had, that we might have touched at some moment, that becomes some kind of shadow effect of the self.
I'd be happy to add to, thanks. Those are such great comments, and I feel like the feeling question is my favorite because I'm obsessed with feelings. So that's a really beautiful and theoretically sophisticated beginning. And I guess maybe something, I don't know what you think about this, T, or what other folks think, is that also it seems to me that what's represented in this exhibition, this beautifully created exhibition, is the way in which, in Janice and Sarah's beautiful book, which is now on sale, they talk about the fact that to be traumatized is to be possessed by an image or an event, and that trauma also has a splitting impact on the self. That's one of the feeling impacts of trauma. And so I think even in the work just to your left, if you're in the audience, we can see, we can imagine about the the three facets, including of three different artists, of what it means to try and bring the traumatized self possessed by images or events, and those images or events shaped by the killing systems of settler colonialism, white supremacy, homo and transphobias, and ableism, and then how we try and use self-portraiture in order to assemble the self into a coherent whole. And that seems to me also the meaningful work that this exhibition and works of art do, is they help us to have projections that might imagine our traumatized selves as both fragmented and whole at the same time, and that's what you're making me think of.
Maybe I'll just step in because that was so rich, the way you talked about Carl Beam's work. Carl Beam is Ojibwe, and it's the piece, so if people are here later, it's the piece just to your left in the Panabaker Gallery here. We're sitting in the Sherman Gallery.
And then the other work that T referred to is Doug Guilford's one of his net. It's called Doily.
Which you can touch.
Sculptural piece.
You can touch Doug Guilford's. He would be most happy for you to touch it. It's metal crochet.
I'll be all over it.
You can't wear it. I don't. So we'll move on to another question or prompt, and this one is about pedagogy, pedagogical significance, and we're thinking about this question for Carrie, but again open to all. How might students' sense of history be challenged by works in the exhibition? And if there are particular works that seem important for students to engage with, And when we're thinking about histories, we are, of course, thinking about questions of indigeneity and settler colonialism, belonging, just come out in citizenship, etc.
Thank you. So thank you, Dr. Hladki and Brophy, for the wonderful invitation, and of course my distinguished panel for the great conversation. I think the theme of this panel really fits into my research interests, which, as we learned in the introduction, do cover history, cultural studies, and Indigenous studies. So specifically, I want to look at history through the lenses of cultural studies and Indigenous studies. And I think this lady has given me great things to work with already, and I think just building off your point, Shoshana, about the splitting and the unifying of the self, I would argue that the historical pieces in this exhibit do that, but also kind of work against that, and sort of insist upon the validity of multiple selves and multiple histories, and kind of remove the notion that any individual identity or self could be contained as a static image for all of time. So I think a lot of the value that lies in these pieces do that work, and they call into question the very authority of the image as a technology of learning, and some of the practices that display and allow us to interact, again, without touching or coming close to these items. Particularly in the work of Monkman and Bowen, to my left, we see artists that reclaim what Nicholas Mirzoff would call the right to look. In this theory, this is a theory that states that history has been created through discursive formations that through imagery, first materially and then mentally, create an ideological relationship that allows the visualization of diverse histories as a single whole. The right to look, then, is not a mere rejection of the authority of Western museum culture, but an assertion of multiple or paralleled authorities, histories, and lived realities. To do this, I think, challenges both the notions of the ultimate pedagogical authority previously afforded to the visual image, and has the power to positively contribute to a more nuanced and expanded idea of big H history, and one can only hope more just relations between diverse groups in the present. As both an aspiring historian and a multinational subject myself, I think these questions are hugely important to the work that I hope to do, which seeks to interrogate the creation of the national subject in the context of the Canadian nation state. Within the Canadian context, North American context, but Canadian specifically, I think visual images and art, both landscape and of peoples, were used in a concerted effort to codify these diverse geographies, cultures, and realities into supposedly unified, if not singular, wholes. My work, which some of the work displayed here, I think, hopes to actively contribute to the widening of this record, and one that seeks not to unseat previous works or assertions of authority, but instead to contextualize them culturally, and hopes to highlight the plurality of experience and identity as lived by other communities, polities, and selves. Kent Monkman, through his brilliant work with Mischief Eagle Testicle, does this brilliantly and beautifully in both form and content. My awareness of Monkman's work came from his series of paintings that are built off the George Catlin and Paul Kane works, in which he reasserts the Bedarsh, two-spirited identity into that narrative as another possibility of how those relationships were built. So I think the video piece at the back, Dance to Mischief, which is a video montage of Monkman, Michael Grey Eyes, dancing with a Karl May piece called Winnetou, draws attention to the idea, the accepted idea of the Indigenous woman as the only available cultural broker through her function as the only available sexual partner to male trappers, and the heteronormative homosocial culture that happened here in pre-Confederation Canada. I think Monkman's pieces, through Monkman's pieces, Mischief provides life and the depiction of difference through his commentary on the creation of these national images as gendered and heteronormative by reasserting this figure in an installation that riffs on the cultural appropriation of that image. And his depiction of mischief in contemporary as opposed to historical dress further helps unseat the ideas of static and unchanging identity of Indigenous peoples, cultures, and relations. As we see in the video, mischief seduce settlers who look a lot like the settlers we've been taught about, and they wear the dress that we've been shown. But mischief wears PVC boots and carries a Louis Vuitton bag. I think this commentary alone leads the viewer to consider not just the interpersonal relationships and identities formed in a pre-Canadian Indigenous subject, but also to the materiality that often spurred those very relationships. Further, I really love the piece by Bowen. I think that was my big surprise piece when I came through the exhibit the first time. But I think this piece further draws on these ideas in which the notion of creating a unified history is dependent on the separating of various braids of histories that go together. And I think this separation allows the broader interconnections of the systems of power to be hidden and insulated from a unified response from the oppressed. By asserting counter-narratives, as Bowen and Monkman do, in a way that Jolene Rickard calls visual sovereignty, artists have the opportunity to reestablish those connections, as is done brilliantly in the video installation Some of the Parts, What Can't Be Named, in which the artist simply documents a recounting of her personal family history constructed through memory, oral narrative, and archival research. Tracing back until the arrival of her first enslaved ancestors upon the shores of Turtle Island, Bowen's personal history is intertwined throughout with pop and political historical moments, which serve dual functions of creating those previously disconnected connections and asserting lived experience, not as counter, but equally valid and authoritative as the mainstream historicization of the events she mentions. Bowen manages to contextualize her family experience through time, space, and nationality, facts which lead the viewer to a conception of historical narrative that surpasses borders or separation of American lands, histories, and cultures. Her creation of this piece from archival research further displays within the museological space comments on use and privilege of having access to historical records that may speak about, if never to, non-Canadian identities.
There's a lot going on. I feel like I need a breath.
Carrie, thank you so much. This was wonderful. Really appreciate that. And also, this kind of like goes back to what I was trying to say about, selves in self-portraiture that always gesture towards some outside, right? I mean, they always exceed themselves, or in other words, they can say they belong to a community. And this community that they gesture towards, they come from, they go back to, whatever, is quite often a wounded community. So this is linked to trauma and to the huge effect produced by trauma. So we get those, in terms of pedagogy and history, you can use those representations that are incredibly effective, I think, in teaching the history of settler colonialism, and also those historical traumas that are documented, vastly documented here, histories of erasure and exclusion. But for me, I mean, just want to bring it back to the medium itself, self-portrait, because it's another aspect of pedagogy, and I know that you work here with students from fine arts, for instance, right? There are also historical narratives that are told here, right? And I started by mentioning Joyce Wieland, and this is like, so what those representations here document for me is also a history of resistance towards certain dominant forms of self-portraiture, right? And there are absolutely amazing instances, like, feminist art history, for instance, Joyce Wieland sort of like working along the lines, why have there been no great women artists? Or you have, Andy Warhol, again, queering the portrait. Or a general idea, still queering, but in even more, challenging way, I would say, or Kent Monkman. So these are all like successive histories almost of, self-portrait as a medium and as a genre, art historical genre, and how it has been, collectively produced through those different selves that we are surrounded by here. Right?
taking a slightly different turn, kind of connecting with another contemporary topic of urgency. We wanted to ask Shoshana to make some remarks on possible connections we can make between works in the show and today's selfie culture in all its complicated relationship to social media and especially to surveillance. And so we wanted to ask you to help us to think critically about self-portraiture today in that kind of context.
Thanks so much. Sorry. It's just, I got these really nice commentaries from my fellow panelists who were like, that's a great question. I mean, it is, but I just feel stressed about answering the greatness of this question. So anyway, thanks for being here. I just always want to note that I never actually would have become a professor if it weren't for Janice Hladki. So she was my first women's studies professor. So I owe my place in this seat to a long history of feminist professorial models, including Janice. So anyway, it's so cool, and thanks so much. That was an amazing talk, Carrie, and that gave me lots of things to think about. In particular, I guess something that interests me and that I think connects with all the really smart things you have to say, T, is the kind of the emphasis that we continually see on selfies and self-portraiture is connected to a narcissistic self. And I think that an exhibition like This Is Me, This Is Also Me really calls us to question the notion that kind of self-portraiture is a focus on a narcissistic self. And something that I thought was really helpful in the way in which many of these works unpack, I think the suggestion that the continual emphasis on kind of constructing the self and reconstructing the self and presenting kind of, as you I think beautifully kind of corrected me, the self not frozen or in stasis, but actually always dynamically changing and also being forcibly subject to change, given the neoliberal climate of heterosexist, white supremacist patriarchy that we continue to live in. I mean, in this moment of national crisis and kind of the increasingly constrained selves that we're able to occupy, I wanted to say that I think that these forms of self-portraiture, I think, are also potentially not in a, I want to kind of be careful to tread lightly, not in a magical, necessarily healing way, but that they also really respond to what I feel like is a troubling cultural trend to really demonize, especially kind of our young folks and our students, as to the ways in which folks engage with self-portraiture in ways that I think are really politically important. So I wanted just to say that about social media, and that I think that we need to trouble these notions of surveillance and surveillance of the self as holding individuals responsible, and instead think about the ways in which, state systems continually subject kind of individuals and communities to systems of surveillance and kind of self-constraint that are, of course, connected to systems of domination, and that I'd like to make that link between how we think about surveillance, self-portraiture, and systems of domination, as my co-panelists have already done for me so well. But I also wanted to say, in keeping with, I realized, so I have a tendency of reading books and then not realizing that they were published 10 years later, and then saying to all my colleagues and friends, wow, this is a groundbreaking book. And then they're like, have you ever flip to the table of contents or whatever? And I'm oh, it's I mean, it is still groundbreaking, but it was also published 20 years ago. So anyway, in keeping with the fact that I'm steaming into the future, I wanted to, so I just want to maybe cross out groundbreaking. It is groundbreaking, but not really recent. So in her groundbreaking book, but not recent, Ghostly Matters, sociologist Avery Gordon argues that the truism that life is complicated is a fact of great analytic importance. And to me that seems partly the motivating theme behind This Is Me, This Is Also Me, that life is complicated, is a fact of great analytic importance, and how do we engage with representations of that? So in particular, Gordon herself notes that lives are complicated by phenomena that are visible as, as well as by that which goes unseen or is no longer seen. And it seems to me that many of the works, I think about Deanne Bowen's work and Kent Monkman's work are troubled by both that which is seen and that which is no longer seen. So Gordon specifically is thinking about how everything from intergenerational trauma to what Sharon O'Brien has called the emotional inheritances of our families of origin, how the ways in which these haunt our present, in ways that we can both detect using kind of conventional empirical methods, like sociologists do, I guess. I'm not a sociologist. And as well as unconventional empirical methods. And I think that these are kind of the unconventional ways that we can imagine detecting kind of these the way in which we remain haunted by killing systems, what Shireen Razak has called killing systems. So in this way, Gordon herself has argued for studying those phenomena that run beneath the surface, rendering us troubled by, quote, things we sometimes have names for and sometimes do not. And we see that in Kathy Daly's work also right here. So that is like we sometimes have names for our works and we sometimes do not. I think it's titled Untitled. I love that kind of title. So in this brilliantly curated exhibition, This Is Me, This Is Also Me, Drs. Brophy and Hladki are revealing how self-portraits do the cultural work of simultaneously, like in this work, revealing and concealing. So often revealing embodiment and disembodiment simultaneously. So here we see, in Drs. Brophy and Hladki's words, as the legs which still peek out as the tantalizing promise of a body that endures. So I'll pretty much wrap it up there, but if we want to use I wanted to use Gordon's term haunting to describe a process that is both not there and not invisible. How is it that we get at those affective feelings which we sometimes have names for and sometimes do not? And if the theme of this panel is also the self in connection to others, how might we think about part of what these representations are haunted by is the impacts of these of systems of settler colonialism. And how might we understand, so for example, in Rebecca Belmore's now I'd say canonical and beautiful work, White Thread, the ways in which the body is bound in chains of red rags that both obfuscate the self and keep it invisible, while making that visible, that which we are normally only told that we're haunted by, that is white supremacy and settler colonialism. So in this way, I would say that this suggests the ways in which the constructions of ourselves are both there to be represented, even as they remain incomplete and partial. And then here I just return to my kind of first thoughts on selfie culture, which is, what does it mean to think about kind of this suggestion that selfie culture is a narcissistic impulse to document the self as a very partial one, as consciously partial, and instead think about the ways in which people, kind of like a basic human impulse is a hunger for connection. How do these forms of self-portraiture also make connections to ourselves possible in ways that still allow us to talk about the ways in which ourselves remain haunted by white supremacist, capitalist, heteropatriarchy.
I think it's okay in a panel about self-representation to make a confession. I take terrible selfies. And then the reason I say that is I'm just stung by this compulsion to self-document. And I use the word compulsion pretty carefully, right? Because it is kind of this, and I watch people in action, right? They can't not photograph themselves, and they're so excellent about it. And then even when they're not great, they acquire implements like sticks. Like I've discovered the new language of selfie and the selfie sticks. But so because I'm a student of visual culture and I'm constantly thinking about it, I wonder what is behind that particular compulsion. So I'll just throw this out. Perhaps self-portraiture is not, or the self-portrait is not kind of the historical connection that we could make to the selfie. Because the self-portrait is a particular class-based, it emerged in a particular class system. And so when people are trying to make a difference in this, in kind of that history of exclusion or privilege that's extremely bourgeois, for example, when at least in photography, when W.B. Du Bois produced the Georgia album, that was all about kind of the humanity of black subjects, that we are, just like everybody else, right? Like that is a radical political statement. And so it's very careful crafting of the self as a demand for right. And so when you and I try to do a selfie, there's that, but there's something else that's happening, and the shift happened in the 20th century. And I don't want to be technologically deterministic, but it's something quite different. It's accessibility of that technology, the affordability of that technology, and the increasingly the instantaneity, the immediacy, and the circulation I mean, circulation was always implicit in those earlier moments, but it's almost instant circulation of this. And so this thing that is always kind of implicit in our engagement with the gallery artwork, right? The one that, so this piece is demanding, it's requesting an address. Monkman is addressing another, right? He wants recognition, or he wants to disrupt kind of the conventions of recognition and a lot of the assumptions, the colonial and patriarchal assumptions behind that. So that's happening, but when we're doing this selfie moment, there's something perhaps different happening. And I agree with you that it is much more complicated than narcissism, but narcissism is part of it. I can't help but think that. Because there's a family member that's involved with that. But, you know, so it's part of it, but it's really, we've entered kind of this, well, people talk about the visual turn, but whether or not we're conscious of it, we've acquired a particular kind of visual literacy that means that we are comporting ourselves and representing ourselves in relationship to the images that we've seen before. And so kind of that moment of self-representation, it is consolidated by the click of the shutter, but it happens prior to that. And it's always in anticipation of being seen, but it does not even require that, because it circulates. It doesn't matter if anybody received it, it has already happened.
Should you jump in? Or do
other folks have? Yes, I would like to jump in.
Shoshana's going to jump in, but then we are going to turn to Q&A, so just a minute.
I think that was so helpful in terms of my own thinking, because I think you were kind of worked to change my mind. I guess just what I was thinking is in terms of the neoliberal, climate, there is, of course, on this impulse to self-portraiture, would we have the same kind of terrible need and desire for this necessary, kind of this, not de-invisibilizing ourselves, or might this, all of these works have come out if in fact we didn't have a system of socialized democracy that's fundamentally stripping away all the care for communities, and that we then as individuals have to become increasingly preoccupied with representing our most basic selves, because in fact they don't have access to forms of care. So it's I think you're right that there's increasingly a narcissistic impulse to document the self, and I guess these kinds of works remind us also that that impulse to document the self is it makes sense to me that it would intensify in a particular moment as we have less and less care of ourselves from state systems. It's we might then want to protect ourselves and kind of our very limited families and communities even more, because they're not actually, those forms of care are not being provided by state systems, as in fact they never were, right? Obviously we're in Canada, it's a nation founded on settler colonialism and slavery, but I think that some of those new deal erasures are also significant.
I wonder if there's another strand, and we will go to Q&A, but I just want to say one thing, and that's I wonder if there's another kind of pivotal moment in relationship to technology and also experimentalism, and that's feminist and queer experimentalism of the 70s in artists, film and video, and sort of the a work for example, with Janice, this is more your area of expertise than mine, Lisa Steele's piece, or the work of Colin Campbell, those uses of kind of fixed cameras to document the self, and that was pretty sort of significant radical work, taking up technology that had become available to do this kind of everyday documentation. That was also at that moment kind of pushing back against systems of domination.
That's what you're getting, the everydayness of it. The selfie is a vernacular practice, and one of the smartest things that I've heard said about the selfie is that it's not self-portraiture, it's family photography. And so when a teenage girl documents herself, this is it's usually the father, at least in an earlier moment, who is the family archivist, right? And so it is part of that tradition you're talking about. It is kind of a nascent feminism that's being experimented.
Taking back technology.
Yeah, exactly.
Using it yourself.
You were talking about what I think of as a kind of an incommensurability when you're thinking about the availability of the work and the non-availability of the work, or the other people have talked about, presence and absence, invisibility and visibility. So I actually love the idea of incommensurability. I don't know if it'll work, but it seems to me that's kind of what you were getting at, and some of what Ida was saying about difference as well. But zip, and let's turn to, oh my goodness, I'm ready. Would you like to stand, if you wouldn't mind, or if you can really project well? You may have a great projecting voice, but I'm just thinking of some folks in the corners or at the back. Thank you.
Well, my interest has been in self-portraiture as a form of advocacy and activism related to chronic illness and disability-based communities. I'm wondering if you could speak to the possibilities of using self-portraiture in that way, like setting up art exhibits or publishing self-portraiture books for those purposes.
Just briefly, absolutely. I don't know if you're familiar with Jess, Meet Jess. There's a series of Jess, yes. Fake commercials, so to say, fake advertising, where she actually parodies. She uses a lot of different strategies. But the one I'm referring to, you probably can find it easily on the internet. It's like the American Apparel ads. Yes, American Label. Yeah. So this is a fantastic way of using, self-portraiture as a way of challenging, the ableism of our culture. So that's one example that I would strongly really recommend.
It's quite a coincidence that you should mention that, because it's work that we had thought about. We wanted to access for the about that for the exhibition, but we could not. We couldn't get the work. But
actually, I know Jess.
Yes, I'm going to check it out.
Janice, I know Jess. Next time you can. Yes, just ask me next time. She'd be very happy, really, to even know that you wanted to put her on this show. I'll tell her.
So there'll be a second exhibition.
There's another one in making them, yes.
Did anyone else want to respond to this question of the significance, thinking about advocacy and activism, and questions of disability and self-portraiture?
I just think that's helpful for my thinking. You're right, of course, self-advocacy.
I've been following two projects. There's one at MUCFS Center in Second Life, and there was an art exhibit using self-portraiture, digitized self-portraiture within Second Life as a way of promoting awareness about chronic fatigue syndrome. And that was all art produced by people who have the condition. And then there's also, I think it's the University of Western Australia has been working on the Freedom Project, which is a continuation of that, so we've been publishing self-portraiture, also created by artists with fatigue syndrome and other chronic illnesses.
There's an exhibition, I haven't seen it, but there's a disability studies critic, Regina Clee, and the exhibition is sight unseen, so blindness in visual culture. It's just a question that I've been very interested in, that incommensurability that we're getting at.
Thank you.
So let's start. It's
a new tangent. Thanks so much. Really rich panel. Thank you, everyone. A really wonderful discussion. And this maybe takes up Janice's point about incommensurability a little bit, because I'm interested partly in this exhibition in the crosstalk between the works, and in particular, it's nice I'm sitting here, but there's art historical dissonance over there with Edvard Munch in between Carl Beam and Rebecca Belmore. And I just wonder if anyone can speak to that piece of the exhibition, how those parts are cross-talking.
Could be a moment when I stop looking. But it's a really great kind of observation that there's this. I mean, the juxtaposition didn't stick out to me for that moment. It was just when I was looking at Edvard Munch, I was looking at. I was trying to rise to the occasion of thinking about feeling, and I noticed the somberness of that particular self-portrait, which is a memento mori, almost in the midst of, sort of the dissonance in these other self-representations that seem to be more euphoric, but undercutting kind of so the appearance of happiness is kind of a composure of the self according to systems of kind of sorry, can you hear me? So systems of expectation, and so the smile that you would expect for the camera is kind of a smile that is one that you've internalized, but not necessarily what you actually feel. And so for me, that image, while it sticks out, is actually pretty consistent. It makes manifest what is latent in the rest of the images. So it seems to be about negative affects, right? So if that makes any sense. But it didn't trouble, what you're getting at is that we have this canonical painting or painter in the midst of recent artists that are trying to disrupt the canon. That didn't trouble me as much because I think that it's necessary in order to have those juxtapositions, no matter how jarring they are, in order to remind us of that discomfort.
And yet, despite this jarring juxtaposition, those two representations still can speak to each other, I think, and it's by engaging with the other. Except that, in the case of Munch, it's, the other is the body, the mortal body, the arm, the skeletal arm there, which is also, this is me, right? I mean, it's the second part of the statement, of the title. And of course, the other in Rebecca Belmore is something else. It's this, social category imposition of this threat of another identity. So there is kind of like this different engagement with the problem of otherness, right, in both those portraits that you can also see as corresponding to a certain problem of self-portraiture, precisely self and other. Right.
It's also so interesting how all those three bodies. I just this second realized that you're not supposed to say much. Is that right? That all three bodies are bound by, maybe that's my own lesbian reference, maybe. So that kind of the anguish, kind of fundamentally that anguish subject and the way in which those are brought together. But it's we so often talk about kind of the anguish of the anguish, as we were noting, that's the history of the white male bourgeois subject. I mean, never talk about the ways in which, I don't know, the ways in which those anguishes are, of course, deliberate and informed. That's what I was thinking when I saw those three together.
Just to speak to what you were saying a second ago, I forgot your name, pardon me.
Eva.
Sorry, just to speak to Eva's point earlier, made me think, by claiming identities, do we necessarily contribute to othering?
Well, people hear that question?
By claiming identities, do we necessarily contribute to othering? I don't see it in terms of a very simple opposition that it's always, self-other. It's the other within as well, and it's, recognizing of the sameness or similarity. This is this kind of relatedness, right, or relational sense of, other selves around us. But the process of claiming identity is a violent process always. I don't know if it's always othering. But you could say that growing into any social context includes that aspect of assuming otherness as well, as much as assuming selfhood. So there's this constant play, of this violence of naming, violence of identity, violence of recognition of the other, and violence of situating the other in a certain meaningful, intelligible context. This is a society, and being in a community, part of a community, always involved. So yes, we are all implicated in this violence, of othering, I think. As long as we, need identity.
Thank you.
Sure.
I think if I could just build on that, the idea of othering, as we're discussing it in these different racialized, sexualized, gendered, abled bodies, to me is really dependent on the system of value ascribed to those others. Where I would think that the act of self-portraiture is actually asserting inherent value in identity. And yes, while that is othering, but kind of without the value judgments that this is better or worse, this just is other. Maybe small but other.
Absolutely. But also one striking thing which I've noticed in many of the representations here, and we were talking about objects and reaching like this limit case of self-portrait, right, where a certain object is invested with meaning, with, it's important to the self. But there were those objects, a lot of artists like, Belmore, Daly, General Idea, and the Ritu, right? We haven't talked about her yet. They use objects which, swaddle, like General Idea, entangle, wrap, kind of like imprison the subject, right? So that is also speaking to that violence of identity, I think. The fact that so many of those representations use that element of, we talk about covering and revealing, and but it's also, I think it extends onto this problem, of a certain violence of identity as well.
Can I do a slightly different reading of those textiles? Slightly more optimistic reading, because if you go, I just to play for a moment, because I agree with you that there is that degree of kind of restriction, entrapment, or encasement that's happening here. But on the other hand, it's another way, a different way out of the trap of the epidermal schema. Yeah. Right? It's not skin that is the basis of identity, and so Bellman's work is really striking. I mean, and it's the attention to the title, the white thread, right? That draws your but you see skin on top of it. So there's a red cloth, and so the red cloth becomes kind of a texture for reading race that isn't just bound to body in that moment. And I'm just taking my cue from really smart writers in critical race studies who are trying to think of other ways of theorizing race. So they're turning to like, what is the relationship between skin, to flesh, to textures, to sheen, to even architecture. So it's not necessarily dispensing or disallowing the importance of skin, but then trying to really cut through that. And I think Bellman's work really nicely illustrates that, because there's the cloth is separate from the skin as well. And so even when you get to what's underneath the cloth, it's not freeing, it's not liberating, but maybe there's a little something else extra, even if you don't see kind of liberation in the form that you would like. I think it's great.
It's also cool. Yes, thank you.
You were talking about the selfie. I skimmed an article, I think it was in the paper a while ago, and it was something like taking the selfie to a new level of people going, I don't exactly know which gallery, but people visiting galleries and not taking a selfie, but taking a selfie in front of a famous painting. And I mean, the obvious thing is look at where I've been, but I wonder if you think there's something else going on there too.
Yeah, great. I mean, it's a great question. My impulse go more towards radical pessimism, is to say that like it's like huge numbers of people are like rendered kind of like placeless or dispossessed, or just that we, I don't know, just like as kind of like capitalistic forms of governance, like increased competition, that people feel like these incredible desires to orient themselves in a place. And I guess that's the question that's been in my head, that I've been wondering if the reason that people have such a craving to take photos of themselves in ways that kind of are linked to like geographic spaces, like, you know, like a famous painting in like the Louvre or wherever, that there's a way in which we have such a craving to reinsert ourselves into these texts in which we're increasingly rendered faceless by, I don't know, capitalist systems, and of course as they intersect with others. So those are my really initial thoughts.
It's a sort of related question, but I used to live in Vancouver and I moved here just after the Stanley Cup riot. And so, yeah, I moved from Vancouver right after the Stanley Cup riot. And a lot of people ask me, why did people take selfies at the riot when they were going to get arrested based on those selfies circulation, right? So like thinking about the question of surveillance that, you know, that you've spoken to, Shoshana, like it's a really interesting moment in terms of why would you want to orient yourself in that place? But I sort of had the instinct to, not sort of do the traditional demonizing the millennials that we get. Like, I mean, we live in a moment also, could this also be about, you know, living in a moment of cruel optimism when like life narratives that we're looking to sort of, that we try to look to orient ourselves in the world are sort of eroding.
That's brilliant. I love that idea that we're like documenting ourselves as like we're getting closer and closer to like the prison industrial complex, or like, here I go.
But like I don't really have anything fairly culturally to say, but I think the whole idea of selfie culture at these events is hugely historically valuable, or will be hugely historically valuable. I was thinking about this the other night, watching a live stream of the Ferguson streets. You didn't really see a selfie, but we're having access to moments through other people's eyes that would have been written out of a record. And now there was a debate going on Facebook where people were, no, I saw this happen in real time. I saw tear gas cans that they're saying they didn't use. So I think about that kind of stuff a lot, like the idea of these things as later historical sources, or even your Facebook account as a historical source at a point. And actually connecting it to the previous question about the works of art, I found as I was doing my research on Monkman, he's just finished a residency at the McMullin Museum. And part of the reason he was asked was because of their huge Indigenous holdings. So he produced this piece using photos from the William Notman Archive of Photography. So he was, I think he was a lawyer in Montreal at the turn of the 20th century, and he would host these great lavish parties, and he had a studio, a photography studio, as was all the rage, and these props. So there's this whole series, whole archive of photographs of upper crust Montrealers dressing up as colonial soldiers, as Indigenous peoples, and he's curated, actually he's recreated a mural, a painting called Welcome to the Studio, an allegory for artistic reflection and transformation, in which he inserted those photographed subjects into a painting as if it was his painting studio. And the center is a self-portrait of Monkman, which he invites you to stand in front of and take a selfie to block him out and insert yourself as the artist and the curator of these images, kind of pointing to the idea that any one of us could have curated the original or the secondary images.
Can I throw something into the selfie mix? Saying, Carrie, I really appreciate what you said there about the value of the historical documents. Because I think one thing we have to keep in mind about the selfies is that that's a collective discourse. That is, everyone who's participating in it is participating and also shifting and manipulating. So that I think part of the compulsion is, but maybe that we need to also consider is that, you know, compulsion to participate in the collective discourse, which And then there's many artists who are working with the selfie, with the discourse of the selfie and subverting, and also using Instagram to use the vernacular of the selfie to present kind of other selves. So there's just a whole piece of it that is, I think, really wonderfully open in terms of that collective growing language, lexicon, visual lexicon. A lot of opportunities there.
I was just going to add that we've been having, I guess, a bit of a sort of just set of discussions in our organizing in relation to the exhibition about, having an Instagram kind of presence, what that would mean. And we were worried about some of the indeterminacies of that, like what could happen in relation to multiple works in the show, given the issues at stake and our aims for a decolonizing practice. But it's been an active discussion for us, and so we've kind of shifted to the idea of having a student workshop in the winter semester where we would talk in more depth about a lot of the related issues, and then do a kind of making activity in the context of the workshop, so that we could have the kind of opportunity to kind of engage in that collective discourse, but perhaps in more kind of guided ways. So that's kind of where we've ended up, but it's been something that's been kind of on our minds and is a bit unresolved, I suppose.
And that's good.
Yeah.
That's unresolved.
Yeah. Are there any the date of the workshop? February 5th, yes. So look forward to some announcements about that. Are there any other questions or reflections?
Yeah, comments. Anyone want to comment about anything that's said here, but also anything in the exhibition?
I don't really have a question, but just as Sim was talking about these selfies at the riots and Carrie was picking up a lot of these images from person, I was thinking about much more pernicious forms of selfies, like the avant-garde photographs, or thinking more historically, photographs that were taken at enlistments of Black people, that then became these kind of testimonials or tourist objects, postcards that you could purchase. So I was just thinking about it. I don't have a question, but if the panel wanted to talk about these kind of, I guess, I'm sure for many of us, much more troubling versions of the selfie as subject of violence, maybe that would be interesting.
Well, I guess this has to be seen in the context of photographs of atrocities rather than in the context that we've been, using here. And so that's a completely different kind of representation, I believe, and it's been theorized a lot by people like Susan Sontag in the context of Autobiography, right? Where photographs of prisoners have been, degrading photographs of prisoners have been taken, and she talks about regarding the pain of others here, right? I mean, in the context of this kind of representations. I don't know, but Carrie, you mentioned about the historical validity and importance of that kind of images of atrocities. You can go back and think about, very old imagery of like killing fields, the Civil War, for instance, very old photographs from the Civil War, or then the Holocaust photographs, of course. From the point of view of a historian, if I may kind of flip it to you, what do you think about that kind of representations? Because from the point of view of ethics and philosophy, that's what I see in terms of ethical challenges that this poses for the viewer.
I think ethical challenges are productive.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably a good thing. I'm thinking specifically of the hashtag that I forget that was going around recently, Will I Be Next, regarding missing and murdered Aboriginal women, in which they would take a selfie and tag it.
Yes.
The hashtag was then appropriated to I won't be next, or I am not next. But the power to actually, people statistics that seem so far over people's head or seem so abstract to actually put a face to these statistics that have been so easily hidden in the record before. I think there's a great humanizing capacity there that hopefully will do some work on a greater society to these issues.
And Amber, maybe don't you want to speak? Because isn't that like it just like Carrie seems like she's productively speaking to some work that you've done, like because like the trophy photo and like the intimate nature of documenting those acts of violence so that you establish the self and who is the other. I mean, I'm quoting you.
I was just trying to think about whether there's something different between taking a photograph of a violent event or an atrocity, right, in the interest of documenting that history, drawing awareness to it, versus taking a photograph of yourself committing or participating in violence against other people. And so I think there's two very different kinds of motivations there, right? And I'm not sure actually how to think about that, so I was interested.
If I can say, like the latter that you're describing, taking a photo of yourself, that's a perpetrator photo. And so that the photographing of the event of the atrocity or the violation is part of the violation. It extends the violation. And so much of what I think is when people really wrestle with the ethics of engaging with those photographs, they're really concerned that you're not perpetuating that original violation by continuing to look at it. So how do you be? So the crux of the problem is how can you be a responsible witness, a responsible spectator, and participate in the work of addressing the injustice. And how do you transform that photograph into evidence as a basis for activating that redress? So I mean, and that for me is a more productive way of framing kind of the question. I don't have answers. There are no easy answers for that, but I certainly think that it's really important to do that. And what bothers me, I think, about the work that's being done when critics look at atrocity photos is the material that I've seen presented at events, conferences. Some of the critics, for all of their good intentions, they're so removed from the atrocity, and I see slideshows. And people, I mean, and slideshow after slideshow of bodies. These are people, right? And when Mamie Till displays the body of her son, it's an important moment, right? To remember the life that was lost, was killed. But when people turn to atrocity, they try to theorize atrocity, but forget the body, right? That has really upset. It's deeply troubling to me that when criticism it falls short of its commitments, and I think that's something that I really would want us to remember. And I'm thinking about that back to Ferguson. Nick Mirzoff has written a very powerful blog post about kind of the body, the missing body that has not been circulated despite the release of all of the documents that have been released thus far. It's interesting that the jury members were shown kind of the crime scene, and in that moment, it's really important to see the body. You know, and you need to pause and look at the body. And why is it that it's the police officer's body that is being documented to show? So it's this notion of what's made visible and what's kept invisible in that moment, and the politics of that contrast. That is really fundamentally important. And I guess our task is always to remember how to be eyewitnesses